Riley's breath caught in his throat as the ship's engine sputtered, the Valeria lurching violently beneath him. The distant clang of metal echoed down the hallway, followed by the ominous hiss of the life support system going offline. He'd been in tight spots before, docked in the middle of a collapsing space station, pinned by enemy fire in the depths of alien territory, but this felt different. There was something more visceral about this. It wasn't just the alien invaders clawing their way through the Valeria's hull, tearing through the airlocks like paper. It wasn't just the frantic scramble for weapons or the warning alarms blaring across the ship's corridors. No. This was personal. He swore under his breath, eyes scanning the smoke-filled hallway. His hand instinctively dropped to the blaster at his hip, fingers grazing the worn leather handle. But there was no time to prepare. His only thought was to find her. Kayla. He didn't care about the rest of the crew. He didn't care about the cargo or the protocols of diplomacy. He cared about one thing only, the alien diplomat who had been his reluctant ally since the peace talks went south. She had a way of looking at him, even when her people's customs dictated that such connections were dangerous. She had an understanding in her eyes, a depth of emotion Riley had never expected to see from someone of her kind. That understanding now tugged at his chest, twisting it painfully. He didn't know where she was. He didn't know if she was alive. His boots thudded softly against the metallic floor as he moved down the hallway, each step measured, his senses on high alert. His body reacted instinctively, moving through the chaos like it was second nature. He didn't need to think, he just needed to find her. The faint hum of the ship's emergency systems was the only sound in the moment of silence between the explosions. Riley's pulse thrummed in his ears as he moved past the dismembered bodies of two invaders, their blood splattered on the walls like grotesque artwork. He didn't flinch. The Valeria was full of dark corners, hiding horrors at every turn, but this was a different kind of darkness. This one had Kayla at the center of it. Turning a sharp corner, Riley froze. There she was, crouched behind a ruined console, her silver hair cascading over her shoulders like a living stream of light, her wide alien eyes scanning the hallway with a cold determination that contrasted sharply with the vulnerability in her posture. Her expression softened when she saw him, but only for a moment, and then it was gone. Riley, Kayla's voice was soft, almost hesitant, though her eyes never wavered from the hall outside their small sanctuary. You shouldn't be here. It's not safe. He couldn't help it. The sight of her, alive, was a shock to his system, a visceral rush that had nothing to do with adrenaline or the constant battle for survival. There was something more here, something deeper than the shared struggle. It wasn't supposed to be this way. He wasn't supposed to care. And yet, as he locked eyes with her, he knew he did. I'm not leaving without you, Riley growled, his voice rough from both concern and frustration. The tension in the room was palpable, the distance between them charged with a mixture of emotions neither of them could fully understand. Kayla turned her head slightly, as if weighing his words. You don't know what you're asking. I don't care, Riley snapped, stepping closer, his hand brushing the smooth metallic surface of the console. His gaze never left hers. I'm done playing by the rules. The ones you've been trying to teach me, the ones I've spent years rejecting. I'm not going to let you walk away from this. Her eyes flashed, but this time, there was something in them, something that wasn't anger or disdain. It was a flicker of something softer, something that caused her to exhale sharply, as if the weight of his words had landed in a place she wasn't ready for. She took a step back, her voice steady. This isn't about us. Her gaze flickered toward the hallway again, where the echo of movement could be heard. You're risking your life for a cause you don't fully understand. You don't know what's at stake. You don't understand my people. Then teach me, Riley retorted, his hand reaching out slightly, a silent plea for her to meet him halfway. I'm done pretending I don't care about what happens to you. I won't stand by while this ship burns, and neither should you. For a long moment, neither of them moved. There was a part of him that expected her to retreat, to brush him off, to claim the same old lines. This is a war we didn't choose, Riley. You don't understand the stakes, the way we think. He'd heard it all before, every time their worlds collided. But Kayla didn't move. Instead, she closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting out a sharp breath. When she opened them again, there was something new in them, a flicker of the vulnerability she'd tried so hard to keep buried. You want to know who I am? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I was born into a world where emotions are seen as a weakness. We are taught to suppress them, to control them. But I've spent my entire life fighting against it. And now, here I am, feeling, for the first time in my life. And I don't know what to do with it. Riley stepped closer, his heart hammering in his chest. This was it. This was the moment. You're not alone, he said softly, his words steady despite the chaos raging outside. Whatever this is, we'll figure it out together. But you have to trust me. Trust us. Kayla didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked down at her hands, her fingers trembling slightly as she gripped her weapon. The weight of the decision was clear on her face, and Riley knew that in this moment, the battle wasn't about the aliens or the ship or survival, it was about whether or not she would trust him. I'll trust you, she whispered at last, her voice filled with a mixture of fear and hope. But only if you're ready to face what's coming. He nodded, his hand brushing hers. I'm ready. The distant rumble of another explosion shook the deck, and Riley's heart surged. He wasn't sure if they'd survive what was coming, but for the first time in years, he knew one thing for certain, he wasn't alone. The Valeria was a dying star, her pulse slowing with every second that passed. Riley could feel it in the deck beneath his feet, the trembling hum of the failing engines that had once carried them across galaxies. It was a far cry from the sleek, powerful ship it had been mere hours ago. Now, it was a crumbling relic of war, a place where the fates of men and aliens alike would be decided. And it was a place where Riley's life was irrevocably tied to Kayla's. The hallway was darker now, shrouded in the thick smoke that had filled the ship ever since the invaders breached the outer hull. The faint red glow from emergency lights painted everything in eerie shades of blood and ash. Riley's hand rested on the blaster at his side, the weight of it strangely comforting in the silence. His heart beat faster with each step, not just from the chaos surrounding them, but from the proximity of Kayla, who walked beside him, her steady steps matching his own. They hadn't spoken much since she'd agreed to trust him, since she'd decided that their fates were intertwined, whether they liked it or not. But there was an unspoken understanding between them now, a bond forged in the heat of battle. We need to make it to the bridge, Kayla said, her voice sharp, commanding. It was the voice of someone who had been trained to lead, to survive. She didn't look at him as she spoke, her eyes scanning the darkened corridor with a wariness that he understood too well. The tension between them had shifted from one of confusion to something more urgent. You're sure about this? Riley asked, his voice low, his gaze on her profile. There was a slight tremble in her hands as she gripped the weapon tighter, but her jaw was set in a determined line. He knew her enough now to see the weight she carried, this wasn't just a fight for survival. This was personal. The bridge is where the enemy's leader is. If we take him down, we'll cripple their command structure, she explained, pausing for a moment as if weighing her next words. She finally met his eyes. It's not just about the ship. It's about ending the war before it spreads to your people. Riley's stomach tightened. He'd seen the war's consequences firsthand, how it had ravaged the outer colonies, turning peaceful systems into battlegrounds. But what Kayla didn't know, what she couldn't understand, was that his people had already paid the price. The Earth he had once known was nothing more than a distant memory, a faded image in the back of his mind. If you're asking me to fight for your people, I don't know if I can, Riley admitted, his words raw. He hadn't meant to say it out loud, but the truth slipped through his guard before he could stop it. Kayla's eyes softened, a brief flicker of something that might have been compassion. I'm not asking you to fight for us. I'm asking you to fight for the future. Riley didn't respond. He didn't know how. All he knew was that this wasn't just about strategy or diplomacy anymore. Something deeper had already taken root between them, something that would complicate everything. A distant explosion shook the ship, and Riley's grip tightened on his blaster as the floor buckled beneath them. The lights flickered again, casting long shadows across the walls. "We don't have time for this," Kayla said, her voice more urgent now. She glanced at him once more, her lips tight as she reached for the console beside them. With a few swift movements, she hacked into the security system, her fingers moving like lightning over the controls. "What are you doing?" Riley asked, confusion settling in his chest. "I'm locking down the lower decks." "It'll slow them down, give us an edge," she replied, her gaze flicking to him for a second before returning to the screen. There was no hesitation in her actions, only precision. She was a soldier, trained to act without mercy, to do whatever it took to win. And yet, as Riley watched her, he couldn't help but wonder, what would she be willing to sacrifice to win? "I thought you said you weren't like them," he muttered, his voice thick with the accusation he hadn't meant to voice. Kayla didn't flinch. Her eyes met his with a quiet intensity. "I'm not. But sometimes, to survive, you have to become what you hate." The words hung in the air, thick with meaning. Riley knew she wasn't just talking about war, about the enemy. She was talking about herself. The weight of her truth pressed against him, and for a moment, he saw her not as the alien diplomat he'd met in the meeting room, but as a woman scarred by years of conflict, of fighting against a world that demanded her silence. "You're right," he said quietly, after a long pause. "We all have our demons." Kayla finished her work and straightened, turning to face him. "Are you ready?" The question was simple, but Riley knew it carried more weight than anything else. Kayla wasn't asking about the battle. She was asking if he was ready to accept what this moment meant. Ready to step into the unknown and embrace something that might destroy them both. Riley's chest tightened. He didn't have an answer, not really. But in that moment, looking at Kayla, her eyes brimming with a mixture of fear and fierce resolve, he knew one thing. "Ready as I'll ever be," he said. A low rumble echoed through the ship, this time not from explosions but from the sound of their own footsteps. They were heading toward the heart of the ship now, closer to the bridge, where the enemy's leader awaited. Riley couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in his gut, the feeling that something would go wrong. But as they moved forward, he couldn't help but glance at Kayla. The air between them had thickened with more than just the danger surrounding them. It was the weight of the unknown, the burden of two people crossing lines they couldn't uncross. And it was the undeniable attraction between them. Riley swallowed hard. There was no turning back now. They were in this together, whether they liked it or not. The air on the bridge felt heavier than it should have. It was thick with the scent of ozone and oil, the faintest hint of something burning from the lower decks. Riley's hand tightened around his blaster as they approached the final corridor before the command center. His boots echoed on the metal floor, a constant reminder of how much time they'd wasted since they first set foot on the ship. Every second they delayed increased the chances of the enemy closing in, but the closer they got to the heart of the Valeria, the harder it became to ignore the pull of Kayla. Her presence was a contradiction, cool and composed one moment, fiercely passionate the next. He hadn't realized how deeply she had infiltrated his thoughts until he found himself glancing at her every few moments, noting how the faint shimmer of sweat on her forehead contrasted with the sharp, unwavering focus in her eyes. "How much farther?" Riley asked, his voice a low rasp. Kayla didn't look at him, her focus trained ahead. "A few more steps. We're almost there." He nodded, but the weight in his chest only seemed to grow heavier. There was something about the way she said it, so sure, so determined, that unsettled him. He wasn't used to this feeling, not when every mission he'd been on had been guided by cold logic, by a single goal, by survival. But Kayla, she was different. Her motivations were tangled in emotions Riley couldn't quite grasp. The fear that burned in her eyes when she'd spoken of the enemy leader, the way her hands trembled when she thought no one was looking, it wasn't just the war that drove her, It was something deeper, something that made this all feel more personal. Riley's thoughts were interrupted by the sudden screech of the door ahead. Kayla halted, her eyes narrowing as she assessed the scene in front of her. The bridge door was cracked open, the usual security seal disabled. Ambush? Riley murmured, his voice just above a whisper. No. But it's a message, Kayla replied, her voice low and controlled. She stepped forward, pressing her palm against the cold metal, and the door slowly slid open with a soft hiss. What greeted them wasn't the chaos they expected. The room was eerily silent, and the lights flickered in muted, uncertain pulses. At the center of the bridge stood the enemy leader, a tall, imposing figure, half-shrouded in shadow. He was alone. Riley felt his stomach drop. This wasn't a confrontation. This was a challenge. I thought we'd be meeting face to face soon, the figure said, his voice smooth, almost mocking. His appearance was striking, a blend of sharp angles and alien features, yet his eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, spoke the same language as any soldier Riley had ever met. Kayla's back straightened. She didn't flinch. This ends today, Terran. Does it? Terran's lips curved into a thin smile. You truly believe that? You're on a ship full of enemy soldiers, Kayla. And yet, here you are, walking into my trap. The game is over. Riley's instincts screamed at him to raise his weapon, but something in Kayla's demeanor held him back. She wasn't acting like a cornered animal. She was calm, too calm. You didn't think I'd come alone, did you? Kayla's voice was icy, her tone unwavering. She was playing him, letting him think he held the upper hand. Terran's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing as he took a step forward. Where's your backup, then? Riley didn't have time to answer before the sound of boots clicking against the metal floor behind him spun him around. Several figures emerged from the shadows, clad in the dark, battle-worn armor of Kayla's allies. They were quick, silent, but there was no mistaking the fire in their eyes. Kayla's eyes softened as she turned back to Terran, the faintest trace of regret flickering across her face. You underestimated me. Again. For a moment, nothing moved. The silence was deafening. Terran was no longer smiling. His hand reached for the weapon at his side, but before he could pull it free, a crackling voice echoed through the bridge's communication system. Commander Terran, we're losing ground in the lower sections. Reinforcements will be here soon. Terran's gaze flickered to the console before snapping back to Kayla. You think you've won? You have no idea what you're up against. Riley's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the tension escalate. He could see it now, the fear in Kayla's eyes wasn't about the fight. It was about what Terran could still do. She had underestimated him, too. I've never been more certain of anything, Kayla said softly, her voice cutting through the chaos, filling the space between them like a challenge. The finality in her tone left no room for negotiation, no space for retreat. Terran's hand clenched around the handle of his weapon, but before he could act, one of Kayla's soldiers lunged forward, taking advantage of the distraction. The room erupted in chaos. Blaster shots rang out, ricocheting off walls and consoles, filling the air with the acrid scent of burning metal and ozone. Riley dove to the side, barely avoiding the barrage of laser fire that streaked past him. He caught a glimpse of Kayla, her body low, her weapon drawn as she moved with a fluid grace that reminded him of a predator. She wasn't just fighting for survival, she was fighting for control. A loud bang echoed, followed by the deafening silence of a room full of people holding their breath. Kayla was standing tall in the center of the chaos, her weapon still aimed at Terran, but her eyes weren't on him anymore. They were on Riley. The tension in the room shifted, the stakes suddenly higher than before. This isn't over, Terran spat, his voice filled with venom. Kayla's lips quirked into a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. No, Terran. It's just beginning. Riley's heart raced, his thoughts tangled in a mess of fear, anger, and something else, a pull toward Kayla that was impossible to ignore. The battle wasn't just external anymore. It had become personal. And as the sounds of blaster fire continued to echo through the corridors, Riley knew that the war for survival wasn't the only fight they were in. There was something deeper at play. And it was about to change everything. The corridors of the Valeria were a battleground, the hum of engines and the staccato rhythm of blaster fire a constant companion as Riley and Kayla moved quickly through the ship. His breath came in shallow bursts as he stayed close behind her, watching her every move. She was a force of nature, shifting between precision and chaos with ease, a warrior without equal. But there was something else, something that gnawed at him beneath the surface of her practiced calm. Her words to Terran echoed in his mind, "This is just beginning." Riley had seen many wars, many leaders. He had dealt with enemies who played by the rules, and enemies who broke them. But Kayla wasn't like any commander he'd ever known. She wasn't a soldier, she was a leader, her determination as sharp as the blasters they carried. But that fire in her, did it burn for survival, or for something deeper? He didn't have the luxury of asking. Not now. The ship's dimmed lighting flickered erratically, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch with every step they took. His mind raced, but his body moved on instinct, his gun trained and ready. They had to find the control room, the central hub of the ship's systems. If they could regain control, they might still have a chance at surviving whatever Terran had planned. "We're almost there," Kayla said without turning to him, her voice low but confident. She didn't need to look at him to know what he was thinking. They'd been in this long enough to read each other's movements, each other's silence. Riley nodded but didn't speak. He wasn't sure what he wanted to say. The weight of everything pressing down on them, the fate of the entire crew, the ongoing war, it all seemed secondary compared to the growing tension between them. They turned a corner, and Kayla slowed, pressing herself against the wall. Riley instinctively mirrored her movements, eyes scanning the darkened corridor ahead. She pointed to a door at the end of the hall, its surface scratched and scorched from prior battles. It was the only way forward. "We take it together," Kayla whispered, her voice barely audible over the thumping of their hearts. Riley's pulse quickened. He wasn't sure if it was the adrenaline of the fight or something more. He wanted to be close to her, wanted to protect her, but there was a part of him that wanted to understand the storm raging inside her. Why was she so calm? He gave a brief nod, and they moved as one, their steps synchronized, both of them knowing the consequences of failure. The door slid open silently, revealing a darkened room filled with flickering consoles and strange humming machinery. The air smelled stale, like metal and burned ozone. A soft green light pulsed from the far wall, casting eerie shadows across the room. "It's too quiet," Riley muttered, his hand instinctively tightening around the grip of his blaster. Kayla held up a hand to silence him, her eyes scanning the room like a hawk searching for its prey. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded, the smallest of movements, and they both stepped into the room, weapons at the ready. But it was empty. Or, at least, it appeared that way. The hum of the machinery grew louder, and the soft green light began to pulse faster. Riley's stomach twisted. He didn't like this. He didn't like the feeling of being led into a trap, but he couldn't see another option. They needed to override the ship's security systems, or they wouldn't survive. "This is it," Kayla said, walking to a central console. She began to work quickly, her fingers dancing over the keys with practiced ease. Riley stood guard, watching every corner of the room. Every shadow seemed to shift, as if waiting to spring to life. Minutes passed. Long, tense minutes where the only sounds were the soft clicks of Kayla's movements. Riley's thoughts spiraled, his gaze flickering back to her every few seconds, catching the determination in her posture, the tightness of her jaw. He didn't know what it was about her, why she had become such an obsession in his mind. It wasn't just her skill as a fighter, her leadership, it was something deeper. Something unspoken. Kayla's voice broke through his thoughts. "Done." The green lights on the walls dimmed and flickered before stabilizing into a steady glow. The ship's systems had been unlocked, but it wasn't the victory Riley had been expecting. As the lights in the room stabilized, the door behind them slammed shut with a deafening crash. A voice echoed through the speakers, distorted but unmistakable. "I hope you enjoy your victory while it lasts, Kayla." It was Taryn. Kayla's expression hardened, her hand immediately reaching for her weapon. "He's playing games," she muttered, her voice tight with anger. Riley's eyes widened. "It's not over." She turned to face him, the fire in her eyes a stark contrast to the coldness she had worn before. "No, it's just getting started. We're not the only ones who want control of this ship." "Then who the hell is he talking to?" Riley's voice rose with frustration. The walls felt like they were closing in on him, and he didn't know what was real anymore. "Taryn's not the only one with a stake in this," Kayla said, her gaze distant, her voice low but firm. "There's more, much more. And if we don't act now, we'll be fighting a war on two fronts." The walls hummed again, but this time it was different. Riley's heart skipped a beat as the sound of boots pounding against metal reached his ears. "We don't have time," Kayla added, urgency in her voice. "We need to find the main reactor room and shut this ship down before it's too late." Riley gripped his blaster tighter, but there was something else in his chest now, something that had nothing to do with the impending battle. Something that made it harder to focus on the task at hand. Kayla was more than just a leader. She was his equal, his partner in this chaos. And if they didn't stop what was coming next, they might lose everything they had fought for. The tension was suffocating. The storm wasn't just on the ship anymore. It was in them. And neither of them was ready for what would come next.